Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon. Thank you to all, and especially to the NECCS Committee 2021 for having me again this time around. I'm Aslan, emergency physician and lecturer from UKM Medical Center, and currently a clinical research fellow doing my DPhil in medical sciences, cardiovascular division, University of Oxford. I'm going to talk about multi-organ injury in COVID-19 infection. Do you know that if I tell you these two animals, the bats and the pangolin Malaya, had the highest similarities in terms of the genetic sequence with the SARS-CoV-2 infection? Any guess, any figures, how much similar are they compared to our SARS-CoV-2 infection? There you go. It's 96% similar, and the pangolin Malaya shares about 91%. What I meant by this is that the coronavirus found in those animals had this kind of close similarities with the SARS-CoV-2 infection in human. And the SARS-CoV-2 is only 50% similar to the SARS-CoV in the MERS case patients and 79% with the previous SARS in Hong Kong. Whether or not these two animals were the main culprit to start off the pandemic, we don't know for sure, but that is the closest bet that we have so far. I have no conflict of interest and no financial disclosure. And this is the outline of my topic. I'm going to talk about the fundamental of science and the philosophy behind multi-organ injury, and to share what do we need to know going forward with some evidence. Since the beginning of COVID-19 infection, no countries has been in exception. Throughout the world, everybody suffered from it, directly or indirectly. And as of 14th of June, nearly 178 million people has been infected, confirmed COVID-19 patients, and 4 million patients has died because of that. And this gives rise to the case fatality rate between 0.4 to 11%, depending on your geographical location and your medical support. Of course, the number doesn't sound so big as compared to Ebola and MERS infection. However, the transmissibility of COVID-19 infection is the one that we're concerned about because it spreads so fast. And we've learned from the previous evidence that COVID-19 infection affects all organs in the body. It affects the brain, the lungs, the bloods, the heart, the kidney, the gut, and the liver. The question is why? What are the main factors that make SARS-CoV infection so effective in causing the spread of the disease and causing multi-organ injury? How it happened? What are the risk factors for the host? And whether it's an acute thing or is it a chronic disease? In order to understand and fight this pandemic, we need to understand in depth about the virus. And once you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not to fear the result of 100 battles, based on what Sun Tzu said in the tactical principles of war. And similarly, we are at war with this virus, and we are nowhere near to win it until we fully understand what it costs to the body and how to tackle it. And this is a simplified schematic representation of how the SARS-CoV infection caused a host cell infection. And as you can see, this is the SARS-CoV with the spikes, and you can see the red color here is the S protein. The S protein specifically binds to the ACE2 receptors. By binding this, it allows fusion because of the conformational changes that happen in the S protein. The membrane of the viral will bind to the membrane of the cell, allows the internalization of the virus. Once it enters the virus, it releases the genetic material, the genomic of the RNA, which then undergoes a complex process of encoding, replication, translation, and eventually it forms two different proteins, which is structured protein and accessory proteins called SEM and nucleocapsid, which later binds within the Golgi complex and form a new set of viruses, new virions. And via the process of exocytosis, these new virions and new viruses are released. Once they are released, they are readily available to bind to other ACE2 receptors elsewhere in the body and continue to infect the other organs. And on the right side here, on the left side here, I'm showing the host response, what happened to the cell, and it will trigger the host as well. And this is an example while COVID-19 patient had affected at the endothelial level, and it leads to the deregulation of the immune system. And we know that from the previous experience in SARS and MERS and previous influenza infection, we've learned how the body adapt to this kind of infection. It triggers the innate immunity first, followed by the acquired immunity, which take days or weeks to be activated. But the innate immunity itself will release high amount of neutrophil and macrophage and natural killer cells, which they themselves trigger the release of cytokines or pro-inflammatory cytokines. And these increase the chance of getting cytokine storm. And they also trigger the release of reactive oxygen radicals or reactive oxygen species, which by themselves combined with the pro-inflammatory cytokines leads to necrosis and apoptosis of the cells and leads to a local and systemic inflammation. Should this fail, the acquired immunity will take over or will be activated, and similar kind of reaction will happen where it will also trigger release of cytokines and aggravate the systemic inflammation. On the right side here is a distribution. It's a picture that shows distribution of ACE2 receptors throughout the body. It can be found anywhere, all over the body. And of course, lungs has the most abundant receptors of ACE2, and that's why lung is the worst affected by the virus. But as you can see, it is found in almost all organ, and it can lead to multi-organ damage and failure. Since we know the science behind it, how do we know how it affects the patients clinically? Now, based on these studies by Noof et al., it's a longitudinal observational study. We know two things. Number one, patient with multi-organ damage is about 100 times higher odds of death as compared to those without multi-organ injury. Even though the sample size is small, but it is good enough to show us that patient with multi-organ damage, once they get COVID infection, fares worse than those without multi-organ injury. A meta-analysis of 69 studies involving 57,000 patients looking at case fatality rate among patients with who are intubated due to COVID-19 infection shows that as they grow older, as you can see graph on the right side here, as they grow older, the case fatality rate actually increase. I'm blocking here, but I can show you that the case fatality rate goes up from 48 to 84%. And this is consistent across the board. As you can see from the forest plot in the middle here, where the studies are conducted in Asia, in Middle East or Europe, North America, the case fatality rate is high. And specifically for Asia, as you can see that the diamond shape effect size is summarized here, it's about 47% chance of death. That means for every participant or patient that you intubate, COVID-19 patient, one will die. So, and because of that, we need to understand further who are at risk beside the age factors. And we know for a fact that as they grow older, they have higher chance of getting other diseases. As they grow older, the chance of them having previous injury to other diseases as well increase. And of course, the immune system is weakened as patients grow older. And this in combination leads to multi-organ injury being the main cause of death among these patients. Based on this meta-analysis, which aim to provide systematic evidence for the association between multi-organ dysfunction and COVID-19 development, we can conclude across the board that increase all studies, severe patients tend to have more comorbidities, tend to have more previous history of organ injury. And in the forest plot, because it all lying on the right side from the line of no effect, meaning that it favors severe disease. And as you can see across the board it's been consistent. And what we can conclude so far is that patient with hypertension, cardiovascular disease, COPD, chronic liver disease, chronic kidney disease, cerebrovascular disease, and chronic gastrointestinal disease were more likely to develop severe COVID. And similarly, the incidence of acute multi-organ injury are 10 to 20 times more common among patients with severe disease than non-severe disease. So the next time you see a patient with COVID-19 having any of these comorbidities, bear in mind, it's not a good sign. Now, besides the risk factors and comorbidities, I would like to share 3 other tools or clinical parameters which are useful for us clinicians to risk stratify patients who are at risk of getting severe COVID and multi-organ injury. The first one is ECG, and based on this meta-analysis by Sebastian Zamora et al., it shows that ECG, a patient with COVID-19 who developed arrhythmias, had a higher risk of death. Okay, the impact of arrhythmia based on these studies is that the risk ratio is higher among non-survivors, and the risk ratio for arrhythmia is also higher among patients with who are critically ill compared to non-critically ill patient. Even though it's something that we know, but it's just to highlight that ECG is a good tool that you can use and utilize ECG telemetry or traffic ECG to detect this kind of arrhythmia, and we know they are far worse compared to those without any ECG changes. Another tool that we can use easily, even in ED or in ICU, is that based on the full blood count, we can derive the neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. And based on this meta-analysis, it's interesting because it shows that those with neutrophil lymphocyte ratio, which is high on admission, had roughly 2 times risk of death compared to those with normal neutrophil lymphocyte ratio. Although the cutoff value has not been mentioned, but based on one of the studies that we included here, based on the ROC analysis that has been conducted, they took a cutoff value of 11.75. But I believe more studies is needed to delineate, to really determine the cutoff values for the NLR ratio. And finally, the blood parameters. As we all know, interleukin-6 is one of the most consistently found, most commonly found among patients who develop cytokine storm, because it is one of the pro-inflammatory cytokines that has been released. And this study, again, is a meta-analysis conducted by Xiao Liu et al. Although most studies were based on Chinese studies in China, it doesn't represent the whole world, but to begin with, it is a good representation of how interleukin-6 can help us in predicting severe diseases. And as you can see from the forest plot here, that the pooled diagnostic odds ratio for interleukin-6 is 13.05. So those it basically helps to predict severe disease. However, similarly, it was not. It was not found a similar finding to predict mortality. But this is one meta-analysis, and there are some heterogeneity that need to be considered in this study as a whole. So more studies is needed. But however, based on the predictor that we have, we can use ECG and also blood parameters to predict who can develop multi-organ injury and severe COVID. Now, we've learned about what happened in those acute patients, but as we are progressing into the long-term effect of COVID-19, we've learned more and more patients coming to your door having the symptom and being diagnosed with COVID before. So I would like to share this study being conducted in Oxford called Capturing the Multi-Organ Effects of COVID-19 Infection, which seek to understand the effects of COVID post ICU admission. So all the participants or patients that have been recruited were medium or moderate to severe COVID, and we follow them up for 3 months and 6 months and 1 year, and all patients will have to undergo several investigations, mainly the multi-organ MRI of the brain, the lungs, the heart, the liver, and the kidneys. And then they also have to undergo lung function tests and cardiopulmonary exercise testing, where we look into the effectiveness of ventilation And finally, they have to go and sit down for half an hour for sets of questionnaire to explore their quality of life and mental health. And this is the image of the cardiac MRI. Based on this, analysis is done, and we do a tissue characterization to see any evidence of scarring or inflammation 3 months post-infection. And interestingly, at 2 to 3 months, a proportion of patients displayed abnormalities in the lungs, in the brain, in the heart, in the liver, and kidneys on MRI. And based on the blood parameters, we also correlated with the CPET parameters, which showed that VEVCO2, which basically predicts the effectiveness of ventilation. The higher the VEVCO2, meaning the less effective is the ventilation, and it correlates well with the white cell count. The higher the white cell count, the higher the VEVCO2, and it basically represents what happened in the lungs. Because bear in mind, most of these patients still present with breathlessness despite 2 to 3 months post-discharge. And based on the parameters here in the lungs, you can see there is a significant difference in terms of signal. You can see the green and blue color for the controls, but for the COVID-19 patient, it's red and also yellow, which highlight that increased possible inflammation that is ongoing despite 3 months post-infection. And similar finding is found in the cardiac T1, where there's increase in T1 native time, which again may signify ongoing inflammation. So the other finding that was to be highlighted is that based on the CMO outcome, patient complain of breathlessness and fatigue, and it affects their daily living and activities and their quality of life. So besides the fatigue, the heart function, the lung function, we also look at the kidney function. And based on this, we can see from the renal T1 images of MRI, there are loss of corticomedullary differentiation between patient who had COVID and control. Now, in terms of the quality of life, we did questionnaire and then assessing the quality of life and mental health status of these patients. And as you can see, there's a stark difference between the two, where patient with COVID-19 suffers or had a prominent reduction in all aspects of their life. And this led us to look into what is long COVID, because a new entity has developed where long COVID is a participant or patient who recovered from COVID, but then complain of fatigue. And many of them did have these symptoms without knowing what exactly the problem is. And they had normal chest X-ray, normal CT scan, normal lung function test. And a group of researchers in Oxford had done this investigation using xenon MRI, which look into whether xenon MRI can detect any abnormalities among this cohort. And xenon is used because xenon behaves like oxygen. It can pass through from alveolar to the blood vessel through the alveolar capillary interface. And what was found is that hyperpolarized xenon MRI had found abnormalities in the lungs of COVID-19 patient 3 to 9 months post-discharge, despite having normal CT scan, normal chest X-ray, and lung function test. And this is quite interesting because the hypothesis that came out from this is that it's possible to be alveolar capillary thrombosis, maybe one of the contributing factors in long COVID, because in the patient who had autopsy, we found that there's some studies that found a small thrombosis within the capillary vessels. Besides that, there are also new development looking at the blood vessels surrounding the lungs. And as I told you before, COVID-19 triggers immune system and deregulation at the endothelial level and leads to cytokine storm at the level of the lungs. And this has been proven using AI, where it detects biological red flags in the fat surrounding the blood vessel. And patients with cytokine-driven inflammation in the blood vessel had shown much higher signal compared to control, especially the alpha variant. So in conclusion, I've shown you the philosophy and the science behind it. I've shared you some of the new development and things that we can use in the clinical setting to re-stratify and detect patients with possible severe COVID and multi-organ dysfunction or multi-organ injury. So in conclusion, multi-organ injury in COVID-19 carries higher mortality rate than those without multi-organ injury. Patients with history of organ injury have a greater risk of developing severe COVID and promote multi-organ injury. ACE2 receptors is highly expressed in the body and accounts for its direct and indirect cause for multi-organ injury. COVID-19 survivors showed signal of multi-organ abnormalities even after 3 months, so something we have to bear in mind. And although the evidence presented were mainly meta-analysis, just please be careful and cautious in interpreting, because some of the data have got significant heterogeneity. And I believe we need more research to understand the natural history of COVID-19 infection, especially from our parts of the world. Thank you very much. Thank you. Hope that helps.